So welcome to our data-driven success. I hope to talk about some real-world strategies for optimizing clinical product utilization. And so there's a couple of our objectives. At the end of this, I just really want you to walk away with how can we formulate a plan and work with you to collaborate with you on creating a strategy for your organization. And if you already have a basic value analysis process in place, how can we elevate that to the next level? So I think we all know why, right? Yesterday, if you were part of that panel and you heard the executive panel discuss, the atmosphere that we're working in today, it's really important to control those costs. But at some point, we always talk about, historically, price at the pump, right? We hear about chasing the next contract, but really if you look across the different product lines, there's really not a lot of variation in terms of pricing from one manufacturer to another. And so we really have to look internal to see how we're using those products, how should we be using those products, and how we can better use them to see savings for our organizations. We have one of the things that I like to read every year is the American Hospital Association's Cost of Caring. I know there was a couple of sobering statistics today during Showme's presentation, and it is also sobering as well. They do a really good job of spelling out the cost of caring for the patients that we care in the different organizations that we have. And I think it was about 83 cents for every dollar as of last year, where that's the reimbursement that we get according to the 2024 report. And so, utilization. Sometimes, historically I've heard that utilization is not based in evidence. I've heard that utilization, it is difficult, for sure. That is absolutely true. But the two are not mutually exclusive, utilization and evidence-based. As a matter of fact, it has to be evidence-based. It's not about using the cheapest. It's not about not using a product. It is about using the right product for that patient that needs it, but not using that product for every single patient, right? And so to the industry partners that are here, when we ask you, help me figure out and set those criterias for those really high-end products, help me figure out what patients will benefit most from those products. And so we know that when we look at utilization, we can reduce costs through variation and through standardization. And studies always show that when you standardize the care of the patients, it improves quality and it improves patient outcomes. And it's always I'm gonna always say, grounded in evidence-based medicine, evidence-based practice. And so when we think about IVs, I know probably everyone in here has had an IV at some point. For those of you who place them regularly, I had a facility who had 51 SKUs of an IV. So 51, when you think about competency and then training of that staff on 51 different IVs. Sure, you're going to have several SKUs, right? You have different sizes and different needs. But to have 51 throughout an organization, that means your staff are having a difficult time finding competency. And then at the end of that needle, there's a patient. And so when you have different staff trying to enact different mechanisms of actions for those IVs, are they going to be competent? Maybe not. And so maybe you'll be using more, the patients will be stuck more, and you're driving your costs up. What's great about utilization based in evidence-based decision-making is that evaluations are now objective. They're not just subjective. It is no longer someone's opinion that something is better, right? You have to look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? I had the opportunity of attending a focus group a few weeks ago for AVAP. And this product line, there's a standard product line, and then there's a newer version of said product line. I'm going to be very basic, so I apologize for that. But I sat down in this focus group, and the first person that sat next to me said, "Oh, we've already transferred all of our products to your new line." And they said, "Great." The industry said, "Wonderful, that's amazing." And they said, "We finally got price parity, because historically this newer product line has been much more expensive than everything else." And they said, "So since we have price parity, everyone should be using that new product." And so I raised my hand and I said, "Well," I said, "according to the studies that we have in Blue Point, all the aggregated guidelines that we have state things like low quality evidence, no consensus, and a weak recommendation. So how can we go from those statements to you saying everybody should be using this just because the price is equal?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's a good point." So a few minutes later, they get to this next slide and they say, it's a 1A recommendation, strong recommendation. And what they didn't know was that across from me was Dr. Carrico, who happened to be on the CDC's HICPAC committee and wrote the guidelines. And so she called them out on that piece. But just because the price is the same does not mean you should be using the products without making sure that it's grounded in evidence. So it also improves, we all know it improves market share, right, compliance, but it also strengthens staff engagement and uncovers hidden opportunities when you look at utilization. Because I can tell you from a nurse, when I was on the floor in the cath lab or IR, and I ran into problems with a product, I would figure it out and move on quickly. But when I'm actually having conversations with someone and specifically talking about how they're using a product, this is when I'm going to get some of that feedback that's important, that nurses may have forgotten about. And you'll hear things like, "Yeah, I usually, toss all of these products because I only want this item out of it." Or, "Yes, I don't like that product, so we use 3 of them because, 1 or 2 are not enough." And so you uncover some of those things when you talk about that utilization. And so it is a delicate balance, right? There's, I always like the 3P framework because there's people, right? There's process and then products. And it is very rare when a product, will solve all of the world's problems. Because if you have people that are, yes, trained, but they're not competent, right? And those are 2 different things. Training means, I understand how to use the product, but competency means I use it the correct way every single time, right? If you have problems there, a product's not going to solve your problem. If you have a poor process, right? You have a broken process, if you have a confusing process. I think earlier today they mentioned IFUs. I think there are some IFUs, maybe 10 steps, or if I'm looking at a product that may have an IFU with 300 steps. Which one am I going to pick, right? And so a process, again, a product is not going to solve a bad process. And then, of course, we have the products. And we want to make sure that those products are not just the latest and greatest, right? We all want the technology, for sure. And we want to make sure that we're providing our patients with that safe care that's based in evidence, but it's not about the latest and greatest that we've seen. What problem is it going to solve for your organization? And again, it can't solve the problem of people, can't solve the problem of process. So I love data. I think data is great. There's all kinds of different data up there, qualitative, quantitative. But really what data does is it tells a story. And so what story do you want that data to tell? And it's really important because I think there's like 2.5 quintillion bytes of data that are produced every day. So it's a lot to really look at. And so we need to understand how we need to put that data together so that it makes sense. We need to understand how to put that data together so we can drive change and we can drive organizational success. And so this is just from a little bit from a Blue Point side. So if you didn't know, Blue Point is our wholly owned subsidiary of Yankee Alliance and really focuses on clinical utilization. And so when we talk about data, I kind of listed in gold, silver, bronze. You know, gold standard is we are very solid in the data. We understand that the data that we are presenting back to you is solid, that we have solid references. We can tell you what department is overusing, underusing, misusing, and we should have some conversations. Then there's like silver data. You know, maybe we don't get all the data runs that we should get. You know, we really want to look at PO, we want to look at issuance, we want to look at stats, and really put all that story together. And then sometimes, you know, in the bronze is kind of, well, we have some data, right? But, you know, we can make some inferences that are general and not as specific. But there are some always key data elements to any kind of data story. And so for you, you want to identify your data points. I think this is really important. Which data points align to the products that you're evaluating? And those products can be whether it's services, whether it's technology, or, you know, bedside products. So as usual, we always look at patient safety measures. So is this product meant to address a patient safety measure that maybe we're failing on? So fall risks. Effectiveness measures, right? Think about your SSI rates or surgical site infections, right? We really look at that as a bundle versus just one panacea that's going to solve everything. Because when you think about a patient going in for surgery, right, there's patient-centric comorbidities that can affect the outcome of that surgery. So are they a smoker, right? How old are they? Are they diabetic? Right? So there's things that are intrinsic that a product is not going to fix. We also make sure for patient-centeredness measures, you know, think about your HCAP scores. I think we just had a conversation about, you know, some technology that, you know, it's older, and does that make sense? You know, if it's not working, sometimes it works, sometimes you have to, you know, you can't find parts for it anymore, and you start really going away from your care plan to be able to understand what the patients in your community need. But you really need to focus on that. Make sure that that's part of your capital plan. Equity measures. So if you should be certified, your hospital should be a center of excellence, right? Are you? Acquisition cost is always that price at the pump. But we also want to identify, is there OR procedural data that we should be discussing? Is it just, you know, physician A spending, I don't know, $1,000 on a procedure, but then physician B is spending $1,500 or $2,000 on a procedure, right? How is that standardized? How is that variable? And what can we do about that? Billing and reimbursement data is also very important, right? I think a lot of times in value analysis, we spend a lot of time talking about the upfront cost. Some value analysis do a great job of pulling in the reimbursement data. Some even do an even better job at looking, hey, here's our payer mix. We get this amount of money on our private payers and this much on CMS, and they can tell you all of that information, and it can all be discussed at that value analysis meeting. And then benchmarking data. I think I've heard this a few times, that it's really important to understand that when you walk into that room to have a conversation about a local contract, do you have benchmarking data? And that's not only on price at the pump, but think about utilization rates, right? How do you know if your particular site is overusing or underusing your product? I actually have a poster here, so at the hors d'oeuvres hour later, you'll see a customer that we worked with at Blue Point. And it's really an interesting story where there was just this one department that was high user of disposable patient transfer devices. And it was a very, very good story and a very good savings number too. But again, benchmarking data, knowing where other departments were using and what their spend were at in comparison. So sometimes when we're thinking about utilization, we do forget a few things. And one could be not asking the why behind the what, right? So when we're having that conversation and someone comes in and says, oh my gosh, I have the greatest thing ever. This product is going to change your life. Okay, well, but why? Why are we using that product? Why do I need that new product? What problem is that product trying to solve? You always want to ask that question. Is it going to be a patient safety or a staff satisfaction? Do we already have something in that realm that has that same functionality? Education not provided. I think that is a big key. I mean, everything is changing so fast. How are we communicating education to those that are the end users? How are we communicating these changes to the end users, right? We need to make sure that that is standardized. I know for some facilities that Bluepoint works with uses the S-bar. It's very important to be able to set up how you're going to make sure that that is socialized. You always want to make sure that if there is a guideline you should be referring to, that you include it. Don't leave it out. I think I've done some work recently with the linen rapid improvement, and part of that work was looking at the education that the industry partners were providing to nurses. In one big sheet said, do not place blood-soaked linen in a red bag. Well, but there's no guidance. Where did that guideline come from? It's actually an OSHA reg, just so you know. So I pulled that in because you need to, as a nurse, I'm not going to do something that puts a little light bulb in my head and said, is that really right? That doesn't sound right. But pulling in that OSHA guidance made it clear. You want to make sure you have all your stakeholders at the table. So if you're speaking in the OR and you need to understand some reimbursement, get your reimbursement people in your rev cycle. Get your infection preventionists at the table. You also don't want to make assumptions about why someone is using a product or in need of a product. I had a physician once, and he used this oddball plate every time he did a total joint. And everybody just thought, well, that's because he likes that plate, he's comfortable with it, it's really not a big deal. Turns out his mentor actually developed that plate, and so he liked to throw him a bone every time he did a total joint. That is a big deal, right? That patient didn't have a choice to use that plate. That plate wasn't vetted by our department, our value analysis, our contracting department. It wasn't vetted at all. So it definitely don't make assumptions. And then not monitoring the outcomes. I think that's the biggest piece. When we finally do say, you know what, my facility does have a problem, and I think this product is going to work. And then we spend that money and we spend that education to train on that product, make our staff competent, and then we walk away, right? And you think, well, is it really still doing that? Is it still actually adding value, or is it adding cost? Right? Monitor and track your outcomes to make sure that what you expected to happen is going to happen. I always like this slide because, culture is, right? You can see who you work with, you know the products that you're working with, you know the industry that the industry partners that, partner with you from a strategy standpoint. But then underneath it all, right, when you're working is, do I have a physician that's difficult to talk to? Do I have an executive support that I can go to and say, you know what, Dr. Smith is really difficult. He's not understanding. I want him to look at this new contract, or this contract is really going to be a game changer for us as an organization to keep us viable. And you don't have an executive sponsor to have those higher end discussions when you've hit a blockade. And so really you need to understand that culture needs to be ready to receive those conversations on why are you doing the things the way that you're doing them? Some people take that as, yeah, you know what, that's a great question. And then others actually get very defensive. Oops. And so the other piece is, when you're talking about utilization, you have to be prepared for the I can't. And I think some of you have probably already encountered this when you talk to maybe some surgeons or you talk to somebody and they say, I can't do that. You know, I had a conversation with a value analysis team, and that was the response. She said, you know what, we're not even going to look at that product because I already talked to the surgeons and that's what they said they can't. And then she went on to talk, and I said, well, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean he couldn't? What does that mean? I don't know, he can't. And I said, that's funny, because really the I can't, it's very psychologically savvy, quite frankly, because I can't means it's not a problem with me as the surgeon, it's a problem with you in your ask, right? So how dare you ask me to use that product? So it's a product problem, it's a you problem, not a me problem. So we need to address that I can't. And so how do you start that utilization playbook? Where does utilization fit in your organization? I know it's probably a little small, but honestly, there's a lot of places you can start looking at utilization. Bringing on a service line. How are you going to use those products, right? A new item request. Again, just because your nurse, I went to AORN earlier this year, and just because your nurses come back with these wonderful products, ask them, okay, so what is this going to help us with? What problem is this going to solve for me? Is it going to be a financial? Is it going to be patient safety? Am I going to have better outcomes? Ask those questions. Supply shortages and back orders, right? I think that a lot of us, we talked about this yesterday, are dealing with that. But as you're going through this, are you building your item bank of products? You know, are you building those item banks of, you know what, that's okay if we have a shortage. You know, we have 5 other ones that do the same thing, right? Understand how those products are being used. Obviously, new contracts, quality measures, cost mitigation, staff feedback, again, I think that's really important. We had a conversation at Concord the other day, and one of their EVS staff took pictures of some great, you know, opportunities for the organization. And I think that's wonderful, staff buying into cost savings and how the products they're using drive the costs. So setting up for success, you really need organizational readiness. Again, there's that culture on the top, but what's going on underneath? And that's where supply chain, value analysis really need to engage executive leadership to have that support to start looking at some of these harder conversations. Educate and communicate to your organization. You also need to understand the data and understand the functional equivalence. I think we just worked with a vendor on a product on the Blue Point side and looking at some data points. And there was a hospital data that we ran. They had 9 different gravity tubings, secondary IV tubings. 9. I mean, it's gravity tubing. It's basically a plastic tube that drips. You don't need 9, okay? So why do we have 9 different options? Clinical allies, I think that is so important. Understand who you can go to if we're in the OR space, if we're in wound care, if we're in the rehab space. Know who your people are that you need to bring to that table. I'll talk about human factors engineering and SimLab in a minute. But setting up those support systems, so like Yankee Alliance clinicians, I know they're in the audience, right? Look to us, look to Sally, look to Mike, look to the contracting team. You know, help us help you, really, and build that team, right? Because it is a team sport. Again, we talked about that functional equivalence. I looked at some data for a hospital, and they were using a sacral dressing. So for those of you who are not clinical, it's really, a sacral dressing is very important for patients who are bedbound. Actually, and it's important in the OR too. It is part of a pressure prevention approach so that you're not getting a pressure injury. And so there's a hospital there, one facility uses about 22,000 small sacral dressings, and then another facility uses about 23,000 large sacral dressings. Same vendor, but 2 different sizes with a $5 difference between the 2. So how can we better standardize the care that we're giving to the patients that also leads to savings? Human factor engineering is another piece. You know, when you think about, it's the application of psychological and physiological principles on the products that you're using. So for the industry partners out there, right, when you come to the value analysis table or supply chain, I'm going to ask, do you have human factors engineering on your products? Right, so have you actually tried these out? What are some of the things that are different mechanically from the products that we're already using? And if you're looking at equipment, I mean, basic things like, does it fit through the door, right? Does it fit in the boom where it's supposed to go, right? You need to make sure that that intersection, you evaluate that. And then take advantage of your sim lab. If you are lucky enough to have a sim lab, I'll tell you, running some products, basic products through that can either push them towards, success in the value analysis or supply chain realm, or cut them off right away. If they don't feel right, they don't work right. I know I had an experience in the cath lab where we had disposable resuscitation bags. We used the same brand for many years. And then one day the contract changed and our cath lab was stocked with a new item. Okay, well that's, I didn't think it was a big deal until the patient coded and I needed it. And the resuscitation bag was in 3 different pieces, where previously it was 1 piece. And the outer covering bag that it came in was, I don't know, must have been glued to the bag. So in the patient, here we are coding this patient, and I'm fighting with this stupid bag. If I had a sim lab, I would have never put that product forward. I was not in supply chain by then, actually. I'll just tell you, I was in the cath lab, so. You'll also see on my poster downstairs a Gemba walk. It's another lean management tool. It is wonderful. It's one way that we identified the product, the disposable patient transfer device. When I highlighted in Blue Point how high their spend was in this one department, they went right down and called the nurse manager, and the nurse manager said, yeah, it's staff safety. How dare you question? Okay. So then they came back to me and said, yeah, Anne-Marie, they're not going to, it's staff safety. We didn't want to get into it. I said, well, yeah, but, here I have your one department in med-surg is using more than a 1,000-bed hospital that I have. That makes no sense that it's staff safety. I'm all about staff safety, believe me. Running to codes, I tweaked my back. I get it. And so when they went back and they did a Gemba walk, what did they find? They found that patients, every single bed was being made up with these $75 or some odd $85 item devices, every single bed. There were some stocked in patients' closets. Patients were coming up with them on their bed already from the ER, so now you had two of these devices, and some rooms even had more than that. And then finally, you have to talk about a dashboard, right? Again, tracking and monitoring what you're doing, and the dashboard makes it visual. It makes it come to life. It allows you to track the work that you're doing, but it also allows you to socialize it to anyone who has access to that dashboard, right? All the great work that you're doing. Or if something's off track, how do I course correct? And just a few, we do have a few tools. So I had to put something in about AVAP, right? When you think about all the work of clinical product utilization, you can't, I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't suggest that, this work happens in the value analysis realm, right? Those clinicians at the table, being able to bring supply chain, infection prevention, wound care, all of those, the right people that need to talk about these, and you can scan that, and there's some great position papers there that are free and public facing. But healthcare value analysis, I'm just going to read this, contributes to optimal patient outcomes through evidence-based systematic approach to review healthcare products, equipment, technology. Using recognized practices, organizational resources, collaborate to evaluate clinical efficacy, appropriate use, and safety for the greatest financial value. So not for the cheapest product, right? And so when you think about this work, I really want you to think, how can the Yankee team lean on us? If you're not doing these in your value analysis program right now, talk to us. How can I get there? Right? I think some of you have gone through the maturity curve, right? If you weren't happy with where you were, let's talk about how we can get you to the next level, how you can start talking about that. There's a lot of education out there, and there's a lot of rich resources here at Yankee. And so setting the stage, we always talk about that maturity curve, executive sponsors and charters. Again, let us help you. And that's where we want to be. Again, like I said earlier today, that extension of your organization. And that's not too bad. 1 minute over. That's all I got.